In our last episode, we talked to Google about the backbone of agentic commerce. Today, actually, we want to look at the front end and specifically at merchants. And who is better equipped to speak with Amir and myself today than someone from Nexi, who works on a daily basis with merchants all over the globe. We had the pleasure to speak with Saggi, a 25-year veteran who leads e-commerce at Nexi Group. This is episode 4 of the Agent Commerce Economy. I'm Ruper, co-chair of the AI Expert Group at Mobey Forum. And today, like every time, I'm joined by Amir, also co-chair of the AI Expert Group.
Fasten your seatbelts.
Let's get started. Hi everyone, we are here today with Raja, EVP E-Commerce Group Marketing at Nexi Group. Raja, you are an ex-Googler, now at Nexi. Give us a bit of an insight. What do you actually do in your day-to-day job life?
Thanks for the quick introduction. So I have a few functions at Nexi. Primarily, I run the product marketing team that develops propositions, pitch decks, go-to-market materials for our e-com business. I also lead our agentic commerce efforts, so the cutting edge bit of e-com. And then finally, I do demand gen, so I run the CRM team and the advertising and website teams for the entire business.
When we prepared for this podcast, you mentioned you've been at Nexi roughly 15 months. So I want to start with a bit of let's say a provocative question, but when we saw AI agents coming onto the field, executing autonomously a checkout process, what was the reaction in your team? What was the mood? How did you take that up?
Really good question. So, at Nexi, as part of my role leading agentic commerce and AI, I sit on the AI steerco. And this steerco has been meeting pretty much every month for the last 2 years. So we saw the progression of announcements in the agentic commerce space, everything from Perplexity back in, I believe it was November 2024, through to the early moves that were made by Amazon and Google. And when that announcement happened, I remember distinctly the feeling in the company was, well, we kind of expected this, right? We kind of expected the momentum to have built up to that point at which a major player in the consumer chatbot space would do something like this. And there were a lot of, sort of leaks prior to that announcement that something is happening, right? Some of these product discovery and payment transactions are actually being built into OpenAI's platform. So it wasn't a complete surprise. But on the other hand, when it happened, there was also a feeling of, oh my God, the world is changing, right?
When it comes to maturity of agentic commerce, we're still in an early stage. And nevertheless, do you see some challenges across different markets where Nexi is, operating?
Yeah, so we ran a survey with our merchant base, and as you know, we operate in something like 25 markets in the EU. We had 300 respondents, and I looked at the data prior to this call. Something like 40% of the merchants said that they felt agentic commerce was a serious sort of opportunity for them in terms of investing their time and resource. But I couldn't find any data that segmented them by region in terms of sophistication. So nowhere did we find, for example, a larger group of merchants in one particular region. Now, having said that, in our face-to-face discussions, what I do find is that merchants in the Nordics are the ones that ask some of the most challenging questions. So I do feel like, Finland, but also Denmark and Sweden and, merchants in the Nordics, they're asking questions which are investment questions. They're asking questions around, infrastructure and skills and experiences. So although I don't have any data, anecdotally, it feels like the Nordics is pushing ahead.
they're asking questions, but in reality, how ready is their data to be machine readable, right? How many of them have thought about generative engine optimization, answer engine optimization, right? What does it mean for their business? Do they even know that it exists, right?
Absolutely. So I think that we're on a journey on both those fronts, right? So when you look at products data, it's not enough just to have feeds available. In the old days, you would have them available to Google Shopping. And now you've got to cater for, ChatGPT and the like. But when you get into the details, what you find is that it's about optimizing those feeds. Everything from the labeling, the quality of the inventory data, so that it's as real time as possible. The image assets that you're providing, right? How do you ensure that you're picked when you're in that discovery phase? So I think every one of our merchants is on that journey, getting their product feeds available and then optimized. And so some of them are in the availability stage and others are increasingly going down the optimization stage. I could probably talk forever on this. So I run the website team at Nexi as well as the advertising team. And, there's a lot of work to be done in ensuring that websites that are originally built around clicks are now available for conversational search. So I think almost all the merchants I know have tried to invest in experimenting with this space. But it's one thing to convert your content to answers. From that point onwards, you need to start thinking about how some of these answers are greenfield and how some of them are, probably addressing things that are topical for a month or so, right? How some of them are more bottom of the funnel related and others are framing the conversation, the awareness consideration stage, right? So I think, once again, everyone I know is looking at AEO, GEO, but many of them don't really fully understand the implications of a chatbot that takes everything you've ever published into context throughout the user funnel, right? That's a big step forward.
It's also kind of a data and documentation management task, no, or challenge for the merchants.
It changes the way you do business on so many levels. You're absolutely right that data and documentation is part of it, right? So you bring in your AEO, GEO lead, and you look at where you're showing up and where you're not, where the gaps are, and you set targets for your content marketing teams to develop that content, and then you assess with a feedback loop how you have improved on those metrics. So data is the starting point. Having editorial resources that are able to take machine or LLM generated stuff and make them into content that not just bots want to read, but possibly help them rise above their competitors is another point. And then ensuring that the whole of the organization understands that your brand is now affected by whatever touch points are available about you on the web is another bit. So I think it's data, skills, the infrastructure to do audits, the whole end-to-end process, right?
Isn't there a risk that it becomes all about data optimization, all about optimizing for conversation, and brands who have built a strong capability on that front becomes actually less versus someone who actually doesn't have the greatest brand but is just really good in optimizing their data?
Yeah, that's a really important point in this ecosystem, in this disruptive innovation. So if you look back to the earliest announcements of instant checkout from ChatGPT, Etsy was one of the first platforms to go live on that. And the feedback from some of the Etsy merchants was exactly what you said. that we've lost the ability to differentiate ourselves in that chat interface. Brands or small businesses on Etsy spent considerable effort in trying to talk about, what was unique about their products and services, about their loyalty program, about their customer service and so on and so forth. All of that was lost when you went into an agentic discovery process. Now, having said that, we've seen this movie before, right? The same criticisms were made when Google embarked on search engine optimization guidelines. And so I think the smart brands are the ones who say, well, okay, clearly this is happening. This is one channel of many that our customers will use to learn about us. How do we make sure that we tell a consistent brand story across all the channels? How do we make sure we build direct sources of traffic in addition to leveraging on these channels as well, right? So I think, pre-instant checkout, brands were optimizing search, social, organic traffic, search, paid, organic, social. In this new world, they're also adding LLM as yet another source of traffic. And more or less the same rules apply, right? More or less the same rules apply to differentiate themselves.
You also mentioned ChatGPT and Etsy, and I was just following the recent news, and what I heard is that there was an internal memo that OpenAI basically says they need to ditch its side quests in order to nail productivity. They are pulling back from this direct in checkout that was communicated in March 2026. Has any connection with this, and what's your take on that?
The question you ask is, is it a question of focus or and resource, or is it something bigger? I think it's something bigger. So, having worked with American tech companies and knowing the context of what OpenAI is going through, it's very clear that there's a huge pressure to monetize. Right? They're pre-IPO. They have to have a very compelling story for their investors. And everything we've read about instant checkout leads us to believe that this was much harder and more complex than what they had foreseen. So, the few things that have come out, the news that has come out is, one is the complexity of handling multi-product checkout, right? It just wasn't set up for that initially. The question of, liability and tied to that fraud, right? So they found a lot of transactions which were, being questioned whether these were actually consumer-initiated transactions. The low number of merchants that were actually participating actively in this, right? So, the list goes on. And there were also some infrastructure issues, I believe, that they faced. So what is clear is that the intent behind this was the right one, right? So right from Altman downwards, OpenAI was clear that they wanted to create a user experience in which advertising did not prejudice the results that the chatbots were publishing, and that they wanted to focus their revenue, their monetization on the transaction. That intent was a really good intent. But unfortunately, because of all the challenges that they met, I think they've realized that it's just really hard to make this successful, to make the business case successful. And I believe that, to your question, I think it's not a case of deferring this. I think literally they've decided to deprioritize it completely and focus on the discovery and the advertising stage of the journey.
Raja, we spoke a lot about merchants. Let's focus a bit on Nexi, actually. So in an agentic transaction, like, who's Nexi's customer? Does it change versus traditional e-commerce, or do you see a shift in who you serve actually in the entire journey?
So at Nexi, we have two sort of sides to the business. We have a merchant-facing side, and then we have a consumer-facing side through issuing. you could argue that in the merchant facing side, we're basically a B2B2C business, right? So we enable our merchants to accept payments from consumers. I don't think that changes whether we talk about traditional e-commerce or agentic commerce. I think the reality is that we want our merchants to be successful through whichever e-commerce channels they are getting traffic from, whether that's chatbots, social, search, so on and so forth. That stays the same.
How are you supporting actually your merchants on that journey, right? What you, especially with your background, I feel like you have so much to provide to your merchants, right, in that case?
Yeah, so I think if you put yourself in the shoes of the merchants, it's a really complex landscape. Every board is asking, where should I place my bets? Where should I place the investment that I have so that I can get some form of return? And they have to do this at the same time as making sure the traditional e-commerce is well funded. It's like changing the engine on a plane in mid-flight metaphor that people use, right? The new world is not yet born, and you have to start to prepare for it. And then the old world is still humming along just fine, and you have to make sure all the maintenance, bug fixes, product roadmaps are ready. So it's really hard. What I've tried to do in our outreach with merchants is try and talk to them about how they can sequence these investments. And so when you look at the discovery through to loyalty process, right, from the beginning of the customer journey, consumer journey to the end, there are some parts of this journey that have been largely solved, where we understand the change, and we have a high probability that we know where it's going. And then there's others which are largely experimental. So let me give you an example. The discovery phase, we've talked about AEO, GEO. There's a lot of literature out there on how you can optimize, and there's a community of AEO, GEO practitioners. As a merchant, you should go all in, right? There's no debate about that. The traffic from chatbots is, conversion traffic is sort of very quickly going to cross with Google and possibly overtake it, right? No doubt invest there. I think another area where merchants should invest in terms of sequencing is, servicing. So the idea that consumer would email their merchant or, pick up the phone, those days now seem antiquated, right? Consumers want to have conversations, possibly directly with AI to resolve their, order issues, understand track their orders, process refunds. And the great thing from a merchant perspective is that this is actually highly, cost efficient, right? Rather than having a live rep handle this, you should absolutely be enabling consumers to self-service. So discovery and servicing are areas that are well understood, will give an ROI, and merchants should double down on. There are other things like loyalty programs. So, the protocols like UCP cater for things like identity linking, which allows, consumers to connect their loyalty accounts to enable them to get loyalty rewards in their chat experience. That is something they should start experimenting with. And then in the payments bit, which is where Nexi comes in, there is a lot of innovation and some experimentation, but it's not yet clear how the chips are going to fall. So in this case, what I would say is build the foundations, keep up with the latest news, but don't go all in until the dust has cleared, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you mentioned discovery and servicing. We can also say that when you talk about ROI and things that affect business models, some merchants also benefit from customer inertia. Subscription people forget to cancel, introductory pricing in the fine print. inability of the customers to compare throughout the market. Do you think that across different categories, merchants will have to optimize in this regard?
Absolutely. So this comes back to your brand question. I think that there are some categories in which agents with ruthless machine logic will drive consumers and business towards the lowest cost, most efficient providers. And they'll be able to do that based on price comparison and comparing many other criteria, some of which would have been shared by the consumer either implicitly or explicitly, right? So, I, for example, am a geek. And if I was buying a TV, I would actually look at the tech specs for that. So the agent will take into account all of that history and context, and then optimize ruthlessly towards the end outcome. And to your question, if price is the most important driver, then you will find certain categories where the margins compress very dramatically, and things like inertia, become irrelevant because agents don't do inertia, right? They capitalize on every single opportunity to optimize towards that price goal. I think the future, which I was maybe jumping into a little bit, was the autonomous element, where you as a consumer have said, I give you, the agent, the mandate to optimize from a price standpoint all of my activities that fall into these buckets or these product categories. Go do it, right? In that world, there is no such thing as inertia.
Do you feel comfortable on forecasting when we reach that point, like the mass market kind of area? I don't know if you follow today OpenClaw. There are lots of people adopting it, but on the big scheme of the perspective on the globe, right? It's still a mini number of people who are actually already using it, right? E-commerce is something that affects, at least in our regions, right? Everyone, let's say. So how do you see the timeline, step by step to adopting human in the loop kind of concepts around agentic commerce and then fully autonomous agents operating on behalf of the majority of people, let's say?
So in the US, human in the loop transactions are already happening in a limited way. Autonomous transactions, the thinking is that we will see the first autonomous transactions this year. Now, there's a difference between seeing the first transaction and your question, which is, when does this translate into the mass market? I don't think it'll translate for at least 18 months. I think that there will be certain categories that we all agree that we would not want to have human in the loop, right? Like paying your, parking fines or, things where it's a fixed cost that has to be paid to a trusted provider like a government agency or something like that. Nobody wants human in the loop. So I think, those are probably the first categories in which autonomous agents will be able to manage. And then over time, we shall see more and more discretionary items move there. But when that happens, is anybody's guess, frankly. Autonomous transactions this year in the US, mostly friends and family, moving into 2027, 2028 as the early adopter, but mass market, who knows?
We talk about autonomous transactions, that when it comes to fraud, we have to make some type of a trade-off between, false positives and false negatives, because we are still early in the market. And if we have too paranoid fraud prevention models, we will prevent some executions that will affect negatively the agentic commerce. So who is the party that bears the costs of helping agentic commerce to mature and grow and hit the mass market?
Yeah, that's probably the most important question from a merchant's perspective. So when I talk to merchants, I ask them this question exactly. in the world of ChatGPT, who bears the risk? Who's liable, right? And unfortunately, the merchant is liable, right? Hence, probably why so few merchants were participating in this process. Now, you mentioned intent mandates. Ideally, so the great thing is that Google has stepped in to try and solve some of these challenges through first the AP2 protocol and then some other challenges through UCP. And so with intent mandates, your consumer is giving an explicit instruction to the agent to spend a certain amount in a certain category. And that is digitally signed at the time it happens. That is a crucial piece of the puzzle when it comes to ensuring that the liability does not fall on the merchant when these transactions are challenged in the future in terms of refunds. Now, once again, this is not necessarily just a technology and standards play, right? In order for this to happen, we need not just the merchants to have access to the protocols and the major players like Google and OpenAI to support them, but we also need some volume of human-in-the-loop transactions. And so, we're seeing that the market is moving in lockstep. The protocols are launched. Some of the players experiment with them, and then a small number of consumers will attempt them. And then these protocols are refined. And so the market is sort of staggering forward in its very early adoption stage, right?
So it's like a step-by-step process. We need a human in the loop in the first phase to also give us a opportunity to learn and to retrain our models and to be prepared for the next phase, which is fully autonomous.
Absolutely. And I think, from a merchant's perspective, you want to be auditing everything, right? You want to have the data that tells you, was what sort of transaction this was, when it happened, and to start looking at the fraud instances, whether they're more or less. And, probably you could argue that before, human in the loop, you might try and have your internal teams experimenting on these by taking orders over the phone and running it in a safe environment, and then slowly, opening up permissions and doing step-up authentication. So it's a process, right?
If our listeners now are a mid-sized retailer, they work with Nexi, what do you recommend them is the most important thing to do next quarter? And why I'm saying next quarter, because we have experienced and we've discussed over the past episodes that this technology is moving at lightning speed, right? And it's improving at lightning speed. And I think we are all very convinced this is here to stay. It's just on how will it be executed? What are the different means to it? So if you want to be relevant in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, if you really want to survive in the business, what is the most important bet? You talked about bets, about financial bets and focus. What should they do now, this quarter, next quarter?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question because this is not a single, piece of, it's not a single activity. There's a whole range of things that needs to happen. And they need to be phased in such a way that you are learning across that consumer journey. So I'll go back to what I said in terms of sequencing and ROI, right? Your board will want to make sure that you are preparing for this world with positive ROI at every step of the way. So, start with the discovery phase. Build out your product feeds, optimize to make sure that you're getting the right traffic, and constantly work on things like the image assets, inventory information, and so on and so forth. The next step should be ensuring that you're experimenting with conversational servicing. First with internal teams and then with slowly opening it up to consumers to query order statuses and ask for refunds. The next step is how do you cater for things like loyalty? And then, the step after that is how do you make sure that you are looking at some of the things that we just discussed, AP2, intent mandates, payment handlers from UCP, and how are you ensuring that you are with the provider that allows you to accept payments from agents in a secure way when that future arises in your region. So I would see this as, sort of a series of actions that are kind of phased out together rather than one thing, right? Unfortunately, there's no simple answer here.
What about Nexi itself? What are the things that you're right now focusing on when it comes to agentic payments, agentic commerce?
Unsurprisingly, that was just my product roadmap as well. So, yeah. So, I guess the challenge and opportunity is that we play in Europe, and so we have the advantage of watching this space evolve in the US and learning all the lessons. And that sequencing that I described is thanks to us, observing what's happening in the US market with the early launches and building out what we think is the right set of steps for our merchants, and then supporting our merchant every step of the way in that process. Some of it is, educational, right? We don't play in the AEO, GEO space. I personally have a team that does it, but that's not our core focus area. Others are very clearly things that we can support with, like servicing, for example, right? And querying order statuses and so on and so forth. So our roadmap exactly parallels what I just described.
In one of the previous episodes, we also discussed the kind of the highly likelihood that in the market like China, we will see kind of agentic commerce picking up even earlier than in other markets due to the super apps they have. Can we also learn something from China?
So I can't speak in my current role at Nexi because it's a Europe focus, but I can speak from my experience at Google that it was very useful to observe the APAC space, right? APAC was the first to crack apps. Europe and the US were laggards in the app space. But it's also true that, in Japan, they call it the Galapagos effect, right? There are things that only happen on the Galapagos Islands and nowhere else. There are things that only happen in those select markets of China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and so on and so forth that don't happen anywhere else in the world. So I do believe that the Chinese ecosystem, the Chinese consumer is far more open to new ways of, far more open to new technology. It's just a fact. Most East Asian countries have that in common. And so they will embrace agentic commerce in a certain form. What that form is may not translate well into Europe and the US. So watch, but make up your own mind about what your consumers are doing or open to.
Very good point.
Raja, Mobey is deeply rooted in banking. Do you have any take on agentic commerce and its threat not to merchants but to banks, and how they need to shift their focus when being attractive to their consumers? I mean, it's a very different business, so to speak. It's less regular, especially when it comes to sales. But are there any kind of messages that you think are very important for banking executives listening to this?
I honestly have not thought about that question before. Can you maybe elaborate on the types of use cases you're thinking about?
If I have an agent who talks to my retailers of choice, maybe I give him the autonomous right to request a cash loan because actually it needs that cash loan somewhere else, right? I might need an additional credit card, or I need just a one-off card, in the sense of like I'm traveling somewhere in the US and I need, the best account for actually conversion between dollars and US, right?
So discovery and servicing in retail banking, no?
Yeah. I can make a wild guess, but I think it's not my area of expertise. So, my wild guess would be that any product or service will become optimized for the context and the preferences of the consumer. And any business that any business that provides that product or service needs to ensure that they are open to machine interpretation, machine transactions. And they need to figure out that point that you made about the brands, right? And the non-tangible aspects of it, customer service, loyalty, insurance, all those things. They need to figure out how they're surfacing up these non-price sensitive purchasing decisions to the agents so that the right decision is made for that preference and that context. But I'm not a banking person, so I'm not going to comment.
Fair enough.
We take this with a grain of salt. Well, Raja, I think this has been a truly remarkable and great discussion. So many different topics we covered with such deep insights. Any last message you want to give our listeners before we close our talk?
I think, 2 points here, right? One is the disruption point. They say history never repeats itself, it rhymes. And the danger of trying to build your strategy based on what you know is that much of this world is being created, in a completely different way. So there's every possibility that the space that you occupy in the ecosystem may be disintermediated completely or not, right? Take the example of Meta. Meta doesn't have a chatbot other than in WhatsApp, which gets limited usage. In a world where chatbots completely bypass Meta, they may not have a role in the ecosystem, right? So it's important to understand that when these type of shifts happen, they are disruptive. And as a player in this ecosystem, it's equally important to place your bets in more than just one place for that eventuality, right? So don't look in the rearview mirror while you're trying to build for this future. It may be a very different outcome. I think the second is a question that I got from a Nordic merchant a month ago, and we had our Nexi Open event, and he's a CEO, and he said, "What is the biggest risk I should be worried about?" I thought about it, and my response was, look, the biggest risk is not doing anything, right? Because your competition is actively experimenting here. In times of disruption, it's the nimble, early adopter, fast mover companies that gain advantage. And as an established brand, as an established e-commerce business, you cannot stand still. You have to play in this field, and you have to experiment, and you have to make mistakes, and you have to learn. So if there's one thing I would say to your listeners, the banks and anyone else, is don't wait and see, right? You have to play. You have to have skin in the game today. That's it.
Thank you very much, Raja. Very, very insightful conversation.
That's a perfect, actually, end statement to this conversation. Raja, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. And yeah, we really hope that we speak again in 6 months, in 12 months, and we see actually how today's statements, how today's forecasts have actually evolved and what has happened over the next quarters.
Yeah, I'd love to meet. And let me say this, 6 months in this is like a lifetime. If you ask me, what would have happened 6 weeks ago, I could not have predicted it. So honestly, 6 months is a lifetime.
Wow, Amir, a seasoned veteran in the payments industry is not even able to predict something that's happening in 6 months, let alone not even in 6 weeks. I mean, we are moving at lightning speed. That's crazy, actually, if you just hear that statement.
It's so much fun to ride this wave. So let's see where it takes us.
So stay tuned for more episodes.